Welcome to Encounter, where we celebrate putting faith into action and community leaders who live out compassion, grace, and love. We're a program of the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. Along with many of you on January 6th of 2020, I was very disappointed with the outcome of a transfer of power. And since that time, I've been reading a lot of books trying to figure out what actually transpired that day and how it fits into a larger schematic, so to speak, of other events that are happening within the world. This led me to a person, David Gushi, who has written a book. It's a pretty profound book. I read it here recently. It's Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. I always want to say Christian critics, but it's actually even more entrenched than just critics. But David Gushi is he teaches Christian ethics at Mercer University in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the chair of social ethics at Vrije University and a senior researcher at the Baptist Theological Studies Center in Belgium. Welcome to Encounter today, David.
Thank you, Joe. Good to talk with you today.
It's good to talk to you too. And I have to say this is something that goes back a number of years, but were you at the Chicago Declaration by any chance when all those documents were being signed by the Evangelicals for Social Action?
The original Chicago Declaration the original one was in the 70s, and then there was, I think, like a revisiting of that. I don't think I was there, but I would have known all the people that were there.
Yeah. So I know that Ron Sider was there, and I was a part of that group that met that day. I went to Asbury. I actually was a big member of the Evangelicals for Social Action for a number of years, and I know that we share that in common. You know, the date with Ron Sider and that kind of thing. And I thought at Wild Goose over last summer, you shared a little bit about your story and how it led you to write this book. And I was wondering if you might be able to share with folks that story and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Working backwards, I am a Christian ethicist and have been doing that work for 30 years. For the longest time, I identified as an evangelical Christian, Protestant evangelical Christian. There was a spectrum that, basically you had progressive evangelical types like Ron Sider and a lot of conservative evangelicals like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell or something. I was never on the conservative side, but I definitely was an evangelical, which I understood to mean serious, devout faith, commitment to Scripture, commitment to a holistic way of life following Jesus, and so on. And people like Ron Sider, who wrote Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger back in the 70s, helped to model that type of evangelicalism, a kind of a social justice evangelicalism. That really worked for me. In fact, he was a major mentor in my life. I became a Christian as a Southern Baptist as a conversion experience when I was in high school. I was all in Southern Baptist through the early 2000s, but in the end, my justice commitments, ultimately including LGBTQ inclusion, but also on racial issues, and now finally this issue of authoritarianism on the Christian right has put me into a post-evangelical space. And so this book, like you opened, responds to, you might say, the Christian presence on January 6, 2021, but also to decades now of Christian right politics that I think have not been good for our country and have not been good for the church.
So in your book, you really talk a little bit about how white Christian nationalism doesn't necessarily encompass the entire problem, I guess, that we experienced on that day, but also some of the authoritarian issues that are kind of prevalent within the rest of the world. Do you want to expound a little bit on that?
Yeah. It's been interesting in the last 4 years to watch the term Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism just take off and be established as if that was always the term that was used, and as if everybody knows what that means. In my book, I do a cross-cultural comparison, so I look at 7 different countries, and in which you have some similar phenomena, which I don't think are fully captured by the term Christian nationalism. I think that, well, the way I say it is, the problem is it begins with a fiercely negative reaction on the part of many traditional Christians to cultural and political developments that they really dislike. And so they are, after 60 years of being negatively oriented towards everything from the civil rights movement in some cases to the women's liberation movement to the sexual revolution to the separation of church and state as it has been interpreted by recent Supreme Court, or not so recent, but the 1960s Supreme Court decisions, to mass immigration from the global south. You name it, there is a chunk of the American Christian population that reacts with great negativity to all of these developments. And so I think they're better described as reactionaries than as nationalists, okay? But the authoritarian bit points to, and that's the other term that I use, so I say authoritarian reactionary Christianity. This is a community that in many cases is authoritarian in their understanding of their faith, kind of top-down, hierarchical, with usually patriarchal power structures, but also now authoritarian, which is to say willing to consider setting aside or trampling over the democratic process itself to achieve its goals. So authoritarian in the way that Viktor Orban in Hungary is authoritarian, or that Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil was authoritarian, or even some, I think, even harbor Putin-esque kinds of visions of how a leader should lead the United States. So those are 3 leaders that I describe in the book as providing explicitly embraced models for some of these authoritarian reactionary Christians as to what kind of president they would like to have in this country. So nationalism is a different kind of issue. But what we have here are people who want their version of a Christian nation, who are deeply negatively reactionary to a lot of cultural developments in our country, and are now interested in authoritarian solutions to problems that have not been solved by the democratic process from their perspective. So
in essence, when I was reading the book, I have to say that I was impressed with the amount of research that went into the book itself. I mean, you had to spend a lot of time in both the library and also in contemporary events in order to figure out what was going on within this book. One of my initial thoughts, and I come at it from a perspective of having read. I don't know if you've read any of the books by Thomas Cahill called like The Gift of the Jews,
or I've read a few.
Or The Everlasting Hill and all that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. One of my questions is, religion has had a very positive influence on the world around us, and yet also has this tendency to be very negative too, and to like slide toward like let's circle up the wagons and try to defend off all the evils that are going on in the world. How do you manage that in your scholarship? What do you think about that?
It is simply a fact that the religious traditions can go in multiple directions. That of any religion, one can say, for many, many adherents, it is a source of life and hope, sustenance, community, meaning, truth, and goodness. It brings good to their lives. But it can also bring harm, damage, problems, not just for the adherents of the religion, but for the societies that are affected by the religion. So I think of my own tradition, Christianity, and I've done enough study. I mean, it's an old tradition, 2,000-year-old tradition. There's a lot of water under the bridge. There have been wonderful moments. There have been terrible moments. And so as a Christian pastor and ethicist, I feel like my job is to try to help Christians be the best version of themselves. But this authoritarian, reactionary Christianity, as it has emerged in the last 50 or 60 years, is not the best version of Christianity. In fact, I think it's destructive both for its adherents and for the cultures in which it gets, kind of gets unleashed.
So let me ask a follow-up question to that. So when you use the term Christian to describe it, do you feel like putting up fingers and doing the quote around it, or is this an actual expression historically of Christianity as it's in a theological sense?
That's a great question. There might have been a time where I would have put scare quotes around the word Christian there, because I would not have wanted to say that this is real Christianity or true Christianity. But I think that's actually too easy and out. I'm talking about people, many of whom believe themselves to be deeply committed to Jesus, to the church. They pray every day. They go to church. It's not everybody on this side, but there's plenty of devout Christian believers who have embraced a politics of this type. And so if we take them at their word that they're trying to be Christians, then we want to ask, what kind of Christianity is this? And then to be able to critique it. So I would not say that they're not Christians. I would say that it's a version of Christianity that has gone in the wrong direction, that I would like to dialogue about and hopefully pull some people back from some things that aren't very healthy.
And some of that actually was very prevalent on January 6th in 2021 when you saw on the screen all the Christian symbols being displayed there, and the way that it was being used kind of spoke about we're rebelling and all of we're patriotic in the right sense of the term according to them. Mm-hmm. And so I'm trying to wrestle with that a little bit as far as like how do you rescue the symbols? Are they inherently untrustworthy at the moment?
The cover of my book has a Christian flag on it. Can you see it kind of?
Yeah, I do see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the designer's and the publisher's choice because there were Christian flags at January 6th. The only time I'd ever seen a Christian flag before that was like at Christian schools. You would have the Christian flag there, right? Yeah. And there were numerous other kinds of religious symbols. And when some of the insurrectionists got into the where the Congress meets, they had prayer. You actually, there's a record of the praying that was done. There were a variety of kind of religious impulses at work on January 6th. There was kind of pagan stuff as well, but there was you might call it an apocalyptic, extremist version of right-wing Christianity, believing themselves to be the agents of God in overturning an election whose results they did not accept, believing that God had led them to that moment. Some, not all, but some actively using violence because they believed it was authorized as a kind of a holy war move. In the cosmic battle of good versus evil, it had become time to fight with hands and fists and whatever, and not just spiritual, metaphorical fighting. It took a while for you might say an extremism of the spirit to finally become an extremism of the fists and of the Capitol on January 6th, but it happened. Can you rescue those symbols? I mean, the cross. I mean, as a Christian, I can't give up the symbol of the cross. I mean, the Christian flag is looking pretty tainted. The Christian flag with Trump photos on it is looking really tainted. So, the Bible, the cross, we have only a limited number of, you might say, symbols in our historic repertoire, and a lot of damage was done to those symbols on January 6th. And a lot of damage is being done to those symbols every day with this version of Christianity, I would say.
Thank you, David. And my guest today is David Gushee. We've been talking about his book, Defending Democracy from Its Christian Enemies. So as far as their underlying beliefs, you kind of in your book talk about them, and like I indicated at the beginning, not as a critic. They're not criticizing democracy. They're actually antagonistic to it. How do you present that in your book, and what is the importance for us to understand it as more antagonistic as versus just trying to rescue it, I guess?
What I think has happened on the Christian right in the U.S., and you can see some parallels in other countries, is, I mean, I think of it as a staged process, like step by step. So, I mean, it isn't quite as neat as this, but I think I would put it like this, to try to also to be sympathetic. The first step was cultural changes like legalized abortion and gay marriage and stuff. Even for some, the civil rights movement and racial integration and mass immigration. Cultural changes and legal changes that people didn't like and that they thought offended their values. Okay. And then an effort to reverse or to protest those changes, or to withdraw to some extent from mainstream society in order to set up Christian enclaves where it would be different. So the Christian homeschool movement, the Christian school movement, other kinds of moves to try to protect the moral integrity of the Christian subculture as they saw it. And then political activism and organizing to align with the Republican Party and to try to help the Republican Party be a family values party, that stage, right? Mm-hmm. And that involved democratic activism. We'll get, Ronald Reagan elected president, and we'll get, laws changed and things like that. They played hardball, but it was still within the democratic process. But what I think has happened now is, especially after Barack Obama was elected president not once but twice, and after the Supreme Court decision legalizing gay marriage, the antagonism towards mainstream culture and mainstream politics was growing increasingly intense. And then Donald Trump came along, and he became the vehicle both for expressing that antagonism and for loosening the commitment to democratic norms. I would say that Trump began sounding like an authoritarian of the Orban, even Putin and Bolsonaro type from the beginning of his campaign in 2000. He was a different kind of politician. And of course, once he refused to accept the results of the 2020 election and tried every means, legal and extra legal, to overturn the election, including inciting a mob on January 6th, then you're in very, very different territory. You're in authoritarianism. You're not in democracy anymore. And to the extent that Christians have gone over the cliff with Trump because of their loyalty to him and their shared, you might say, panic over losing, and over the direction of the culture, then you have something that becomes a threat to democracy itself. There are also voices of intellectuals, some of whom I cite in the book, who are expressing real doubt about whether our way of doing democracy is something that we should continue to be committed to.
One of them was that you cited in the book was a Polish scholar. And I thought that was kind of interesting, his use of language, even to describe the LGBTQ plus group. And I thought that it seemed to me as if that group of people almost is a lightning rod for the issue. And so, what is it about, I guess, what is it about LGBTQ plus people that acts as that lightning rod? And historically, how does that fit in? I mean, is this the first time where this is kind of transpired? I know that Nazism, for instance, really had a problem with homosexuality in general as well. But is this, how does that? It almost seems to me as if like you've taken like 10% or less of the population and have made it into a fueling rod for political activism. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me on a larger historical perspective like that.
I'm glad you mentioned that. The Polish politician Legutko, as I recall, was his name. He was expressing the most contemptuous attitudes towards LGBTQ people, including language that is deeply offensive. And that sneering contempt at this small minority of the human population is something that you can see in each of the countries that I study in the book that have a authoritarian reactionary thing going, whether it's Russia, Hungary, Poland under the Law and Justice Party, which has recently been defeated, that guy's party, right? Brazil under Bolsonaro, and a lot of people on the Christian right in the U.S. This isn't actually Trump's main language. One of the few good things I can say about Trump, he doesn't really do gay baiting or gay bashing the way that some of the people around him do. But why them? For decades, LGBTQ people have been treated on the right as a threat to traditional values, traditional morality, the family, children, religion. The ultimate boogeyman, and everybody who is attempting to gain political power by playing the reactionary card, it seems, plays the anti-gay card as part of that. This makes life very, very dangerous, even lethal, certainly uncomfortable and sad for our LGBTQ neighbors. And the fact that this is being done often in the name of Christ and church and Bible makes it all the worse. Jesus, who taught us to love our neighbors as ourselves, must weep when he sees the way that Christians demagogue against this particular population who are already vulnerable,
right, to
gain political points and drive up their vote share in this or that population. LGBTQ people are not our enemies. They're just human beings trying to live their lives like anyone else. But they become a convenient target for people on the reactionary right in many countries.
So in your book, David, you go on to talk about some of some of the cures, so to speak, for the ailment. Do you want to expound on that a little bit?
Yeah. Big picture, 30,000 feet, I would say Christianity is an ancient religion that had 1,500 years of experience of essentially embracing authoritarianism. The whole Christendom paradigm, the Christian emperor, the Christian king, the Christian Queen, the Christian nation. I mean, that's a lot of the legacy. I mean, think of Great Britain and France before the Revolution, and Spain, and you name it, right? All the colonizing powers, all of the European powers, Christian civilizations, quote unquote, with Christian monarchs and Christian bishops and so on, working hand in glove to advance their shared goals. It's relatively modern. It was a relatively modern development that really began after the Reformation for many Christians to begin to question this whole arrangement. And I name three strands of pro-democracy Christianity. The first is Congregationalist religion. I mentioned specifically my own tradition, the Baptist tradition, born in England as you might say the radical wing of the Puritan movement, asking for the freedom to practice religion without being harassed by the state, and ultimately asking for the state to roll back its efforts to organize and demand religious conformity. I mentioned the Puritans themselves overall in the covenantalism of their tradition. And part of the genius of the covenantal tradition is it basically said that political community and church community doesn't come from above and or shouldn't come from above, but instead is the product of a people choosing to make a voluntary agreement to live in community together. So covenantalism is a legacy that is precious both for church life and for politics, including our own governmental system here. And then I also mention the Black church tradition in its abolitionism and its commitment to social justice and to real democracy. So what I'm trying to say is authoritarianism has deep bloodlines in our tradition, but we rejected it for good reasons 400 years ago, and we should reject it today. Listening to the covenantalists, the Congregationalists, and the Black church freedom movements is a place to start.
My guest today has been David Gushee. Gushee, we have been talking about is defending democracy from its Christian enemies. Beautiful book. I would recommend it to anyone who's wanting to understand a little bit about what happened on January 6th, 2021, and perhaps on how we can begin to organize and help cure the problem of white Christian nationalism in using those terms, or using authoritarian reactionary Christian nationalism that David talks a little bit about in his book. So I'm grateful for you, David, for being on Encounter. I hope that all of you will have a good day and be good and gentle to each other. Thank you for being on Encounter.
Thanks, Joe.